Coming home from war is supposed to be a relief. You leave behind the constant vigilance, the hyper-awareness, the knowledge that every shadow might hide a threat. You return to familiar ground, where the rules make sense again, where you know the territory, where you're no longer prey to unseen dangers. But what happens when that safety proves to be an illusion? For two Marines returning from Afghanistan in 2014, the mountains of East Tennessee represented everything war wasn't. The Great Smoky Mountains had been their playground since boyhood, long before the Corps taught them to move through hostile terrain with rifles and night optics. These weren't the alien landscapes of Helmand Province. This was home. Every ridge, every hollow, every game trail mapped in their memories from years of hunting whitetail and turkey with their fathers and grandfathers. They'd grown up doing what generations before them had done, managing the land, protecting livestock, keeping the balance between civilization and wilderness. When coyotes started hitting local farms that autumn, decimating chicken coops and taking down young calves, the solution seemed straightforward. Two combat veterans with deer rifles against some mangy predators should have been simple work. They were wrong. The thing about modern warfare is that it teaches you to think like a hunter. Infantry Marines learn to read terrain, to predict movement patterns, to understand how their enemy thinks. They study tactics and counter-tactics. They learn that in any engagement, victory belongs to whoever better understands their opponent's mind. But what these two Marines didn't consider, couldn't have considered, was a different kind of opponent. One that had been studying them just as carefully as they'd studied it. One that understood human behavior with an intelligence that shouldn't exist outside our species. One that could predict their every move, because it had watched countless hunters before them make the same mistakes. The account that follows comes from Jake Hutchins and Tyler Brennan, both former 0311 riflemen who served together in 3rd Battalion 5th Marines. Their deployment to Sangin District in 2012 had been rough, the kind of deployment where you came home different, where the silence of civilian life feels unnatural, where part of you misses the clarity of a world divided into friendly and hostile. Neither man had much trouble readjusting compared to some of their brothers. They had each other, they had their families, and they had these mountains. The woods offered something they needed, a place where their training still mattered, where being alert and observant was an asset rather than a symptom. What happened to them in November 2014 shattered that sense of control. It revealed that even here, in the heart of Appalachia, where their families had lived for 6 generations, there were threats their grandfathers never spoke of, dangers that didn't fit into any framework the Marine Corps had taught them. This isn't a story about post-deployment stress or overactive imaginations. Both men are still active in their community, well-respected and grounded. They don't share this account lightly or often. When they do talk about it, there's no embellishment, no dramatic flourish. Just two men describing what they saw and what they came to understand about it later. The Great Smoky Mountains have their own history of strange encounters. Cherokee legends speak of things in the deep forest that walk on 2 legs, but aren't human. Settlers reported vanishings in odd tracks. Park rangers, when pressed and off the record, will sometimes mention things they've seen or heard that don't match any known wildlife. But this incident stands apart because of who witnessed it. These weren't hikers startled by shadows or locals repeating old tales. These were 2 men trained to observe, to remain calm under pressure, to accurately assess threats. Men who'd faced actual combat and knew the difference between fear and genuine danger. What they encountered in those woods wasn't a bear standing upright or a trick of moonlight. It was something that demonstrated intelligence, planning, and an understanding of human behavior that defies natural explanation. And it was hunting them. Jake Hutchins and Tyler Brennan had known each other since 3rd grade at Pittman Center Elementary. Their friendship was built on shared experience, fishing the Little Pigeon River, riding 4-wheelers through their family's adjacent properties, and learning to shoot with their fathers at the makeshift range behind the Brennan barn. When Jake enlisted in the Marines 2 weeks after high school graduation, Tyler followed him to the recruiter's office the next day. They shipped to Paris Island together in June 2010, made it through the Crucible as part of the same platoon, earned their Eagle, Globe, and Anchor on the same September morning. The Corps had a way of taking friendships and tempering them into something harder, more reliable. By the time they reported to 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines at Camp Pendleton, they'd learned to communicate without words, to anticipate each other's movements, to trust completely. Sangin District tested that trust daily. Their deployment ran from March through October 2012. 7 months of dismounted patrols through grape fields and compound clusters where every doorway might conceal a Y-fighter. Every dirt pile might hide an IED. They lost 3 men from their squad, saw a dozen more get medevaced with missing limbs or sucking chest wounds. Jake took a piece of shrapnel in his shoulder during a firefight in July. Nothing serious enough for evacuation, just enough to leave a scar and earn him his Purple Heart. Tyler pulled him behind a mud wall while returning fire, then provided cover while their corpsmen worked on him. That kind of thing either breaks a friendship or forges it into something unbreakable. When they rotated back to Pendleton that November, both men had already decided they were done. 4 years was enough. They'd seen what they needed to see, done what they needed to do. Neither planned to make a career of it. They had homes waiting, families who needed them around, lives they'd put on hold. They finished their contracts in June 2014 and drove cross-country together, Jake's pickup truck loaded with sea bags and deployment boxes, heading back to Sevier County. The return felt surreal. Everything looked smaller than they remembered. The mountains that had seemed so massive in their childhood now felt intimate, manageable. Gatlinburg's tourist traffic annoyed them in ways it never had before. They found themselves noticing sight lines and choke points, scanning rooftops out of habit. "Takes a while," Jake's father told him one evening on the porch. "Your granddad came back from Korea like that. Took him near about a year before he stopped checking corners." By November, they both settled into routines. Jake was working construction with his uncle's crew, framing houses in the new development off Highway 321. Tyler had taken a job with the Sevierville Public Works Department, driving a truck and maintaining roads. Good work, honest work, the kind of employment that let them sleep at night without dreams of grape fields and gunfire. They still hunted together most weekends. Deer season had opened in mid-September, and they'd each tagged a doe for their family's freezers. The rituals felt good, familiar in ways that combat never had. Clean kills, ethical hunting, meat that meant something. Not the random violence of war, but purposeful harvest, tied to the land and seasons. The coyote problem started showing up in conversations at the feed store and the diner. Farmers around Pittman Center and Cosby had been losing chickens. Otis Webb lost 4 hens in a single night, found nothing but feathers and blood. The Caldwell place lost a young calf, something that took it down and fed on it where it fell. Tracks in the mud showed coyote paw prints, bigger than usual but definitely canine. "They're getting bolder," said Vernon Ramsey, a tobacco farmer whose family had worked the same land since before the Civil War. He was sitting at the counter of the Smoky Mountain Diner when Jake and Tyler came in for breakfast. "Used to be they'd stay up in the high country. Now they're coming right down to the pens, middle of the night, no fear at all." Tennessee Wildlife Resources had confirmed the population boom. Coyotes had migrated into East Tennessee over the past 2 decades, filling the ecological niche left by wolves and mountain lions. Without natural predators and with plenty of prey, their numbers had exploded. The agency recommended culling, particularly around livestock operations. "You boys still know how to shoot, don't you?" Vernon asked, eyeing them over his coffee mug. "Seems like we could use some help thinning these things out before they get any worse." Jake and Tyler had grown up hunting coyotes, not for sport, though some did it that way. For them, it was pest control, same as shooting groundhogs or trapping possums that got into the crawl space. Their fathers had taught them the methods: predator calls that mimicked injured rabbits or distressed fawns, High-powered rifles with good scopes, patience to wait them out. "We can handle that," Tyler said. "Been meaning to get out there anyway." They spent the next week preparing. Jake's Remington 700 in .308 Winchester had been his grandfather's deer rifle, a weapon he knew intimately. Tyler preferred his AR-15 platform with a 6.5 Grendel upper, giving him quick follow-up shots if needed. Both rifles wore decent optics, nothing fancy, but adequate for shots out to 300 yards. They loaded their magazines on a Friday evening at Jake's place, his kitchen table covered with ammunition boxes and cleaning supplies. His wife, Emily, watched from the doorway with their 6-month-old daughter on her hip. "Y'all be careful out there," she said. "I know it's just coyotes, but still." "Yes, ma'am," Jake replied automatically, the way he'd been taught since childhood. "We'll have our radios. Be back before dawn." They'd scouted the area earlier that week, identifying a ravine system north of Cosby where several farmers had reported activity. The terrain was familiar, an area they'd hunted since their teens. Steep ridges covered in oak and hickory, hollows thick with rhododendron and laurel. Old logging roads that provided access if you knew where to look. The plan was straightforward. They'd hike in before sunset, establish a position overlooking the ravine, use an electronic collar to bring the coyotes in, and take shots as opportunities presented. Simple work for anyone who knew the woods. Friday afternoon, they loaded Tyler's truck with their gear: rifles, ammunition, headlamps, handheld radios, thermoses of coffee, protein bars. Tyler had a thermal monocular he'd bought after getting out, a civilian model that wasn't as good as military thermals, but good enough for spotting animals in darkness. They weren't planning to use night vision. The moon was nearly full, and they knew the terrain well enough to move without artificial light until they needed it for shooting. They drove out Highway 321 toward Cosby, then turned onto Catons Grove Road, following it until pavement gave way to gravel. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ridges. November had stripped most leaves from the deciduous trees, leaving the forest open and easier to navigate. "Feels good being back out here," Tyler said as they geared up at the trailhead. "Beats the hell out of Helmand." "Amen to that," Jake replied, slinging his rifle. "At least here we know what we're dealing with." They started up the ridge around 1700 hours, wanting to be in position before the light failed completely. The hike took 40 minutes, following an old game trail that switchbacked up the slope. Their boots found purchase on familiar ground, muscles remembering the rhythm of mountain walking. At the top, they moved along the ridgeline another half-mile before dropping down toward the ravine they'd identified. The terrain funneled here, a natural corridor where animals would travel between the higher elevations and the farm valley below. Perfect ambush point for predators, which made it perfect for hunters too. They found a spot where a fallen oak created natural cover, giving them a clear view of the ravine bottom about 60 yards out. The electronic collar went down in the clearing, camouflaged with leaves and brush. Tyler checked the remote to ensure it worked. Then they settled in to wait. The sun dropped behind the western ridges, turning the sky purple, then indigo. Temperature fell with the light, their breath beginning to show in small clouds. They dressed in layers, knowing they'd be stationary for hours. Around them, the forest made its evening transition, daybirds quieting, night creatures beginning to stir. "Good spot," Jake whispered. "If they're in this area, they'll come through here." Tyler nodded, scanning the ravine with his thermal. Not picking up anything yet. Give it time. They waited, comfortable in silence. Two men who'd spent enough time together that conversation wasn't necessary. The moon rose, bright enough to cast shadows. Somewhere downslope, an owl called. The wind stayed light, barely enough to rattle the dry leaves, still clinging to the oaks. At 2100 hours, they heard the first sound. It came from the ravine bottom, maybe 200 yards deeper into the hollow. High-pitched yelping, the distinctive cry of young coyotes in distress. Both men came alert immediately. Years of hunting experience recognizing exactly what they were hearing. "Pups," Tyler breathed. "Sounds like something's hitting their den." Jake listened carefully. The cries continued, periodic bursts of yipping and whining that pulled at something primal in the brain. The adult coyotes would be responding to that sound, rushing to defend their young. It was exactly what they'd hoped for, though they hadn't expected nature to provide its own distress call. "How far you think?" Jake asked quietly. Tyler checked his thermal, scanning the ravine bottom. "Can't see that far with this thing. Trees are too thick. Maybe quarter mile?" The cries continued, growing more urgent. Both men felt it simultaneously. That old familiar pull, the instinct that had made them successful hunters since adolescence. Something was hurting those pups. The adults would be converging on that location. If they moved carefully, they could set up closer and intercept the coyotes responding. It made sense. Perfect sense. The kind of decision they'd made hundreds of times before. Jake looked at Tyler. Tyler looked back. A wordless conversation passed between them, the kind of communication forged in the core and proven in combat. They gathered their gear and started moving toward the sound. Moving through the Smoky Mountains at night required a different kind of awareness than daylight hunting. Jake led, Tyler following 10 feet behind, both men spacing themselves automatically, the way they'd learned on patrol. Their rifles stayed at low ready, fingers indexed along the receiver groups rather than on triggers. Safety protocols became second nature after enough time carrying weapons. The cries continued from deeper in the hollow, guiding them like a beacon. Young coyotes, definitely. That high-pitched quality couldn't be mistaken for anything else. Jake had heard it before, years ago, when he and his father had stumbled across a den while turkey hunting. The memory felt solid, reliable. This was the same sound. They descended carefully, using trees for handholds on the steeper sections. The forest floor was a carpet of dry leaves that crunched under their boots, no matter how carefully they stepped. In summer, the undergrowth would have been thick enough to conceal them, but November left everything exposed. Bare branches created a skeletal canopy overhead, allowing moonlight through in patches. After 20 minutes, they'd covered maybe 300 yards. The terrain worked against speed, forcing them to navigate around laurel thickets and fallen timber. The cries seemed closer now, though distance was hard to judge in these hollows. Sound bounced off ridges and played tricks, sometimes making things seem nearer or farther than they actually were. Tyler held up a fist. Both men stopped. He pointed to his ear, then gestured forward. Jake nodded, and they continued, slower now, placing each boot deliberately. The ravine bottom leveled out into a small creek bed, mostly dry this time of year, with just a trickle of water running through the center. Moss-covered rocks and exposed tree roots created obstacles that required attention. They crossed carefully, boots finding purchase on stones slick with moisture. On the far side, the cries stopped. Complete silence fell over the hollow. No wind, no distant owl, no rustle of small animals in the leaf litter, just absolute quiet that felt like pressure against their eardrums. Jake froze mid-step. Tyler did the same. They'd both learned that stillness was a weapon, that sometimes not moving revealed more than movement could. They waited, breathing slowly through their noses, watching the darkness ahead. 30 seconds passed. A minute. The silence continued, unbroken and complete. Then the cry started again, but different now. Closer, maybe another 100 yards ahead, up a slight rise where the hollow bent to the left. The same high-pitched yelping, the same pattern of distressed pups calling for their mother. Jake felt something shift in his gut. Not quite wrong, but not quite right either. He couldn't articulate what bothered him. The sound was perfect. Too perfect, maybe. Like a recording rather than a living thing. He glanced back at Tyler, whose face was barely visible in the dim moonlight filtering through the trees. Tyler's expression told him nothing, but his posture had changed, more rigid, more alert. They continued forward, covering another 50 yards before the cries stopped again. This time they waited in place, not moving, letting their eyes and ears do the work. The silence stretched. 2 minutes. 3. Jake counted his breaths, a technique they'd used on long observation posts in Afghanistan when staying alert meant staying alive. Count to 4 on the inhale, hold for 4, exhale for 4, repeat. Keep the mind sharp. When the cries started again, they came from ahead and to the right. Higher ground, maybe 60 yards distant. The exact same pitch, the exact same rhythm. Not similar, identical. Tyler moved up next to Jake, close enough to whisper directly into his ear. That's the same track. Jake had been thinking it, but hadn't wanted to say it. Now that Tyler confirmed it, the wrongness became undeniable. Animals didn't make identical sounds. Even recordings played multiple times had slight variations in volume, tone, ambient noise. But this was perfect repetition, like someone hitting play on the same audio file over and over, except there was no electronic device out here, no speakers, no radios, no explanation that made sense. Could be an echo, Jake whispered back, sound bouncing off the ridges. Even as he said it, he knew it was wrong. Echoes degraded, they lost fidelity. They didn't maintain perfect clarity across multiple repetitions. They held position, both men's brains working through possibilities. A hunter using an electronic collar? Possible, but they hadn't seen any vehicles at trailheads, hadn't heard any evidence of other people in these woods, and no hunter would use coyote pup calls anyway. You called adults in with prey animal sounds, not their own offspring. The cries came again. Ahead now, straight up the slope, maybe 40 yards, close enough that they should be seeing movement, hearing the rustle of animals in the brush. But there was nothing except that sound, pristine and clear in the darkness. Jake's hands tightened on his rifle, not from fear exactly, from the recognition that something was off, that the parameters of this situation didn't match his expectations. It was the same feeling he'd gotten on patrol when a street in Sangin looked normal but felt lethal, when every sense screamed warning even though nothing visible justified it. "We should pull back," Tyler said quietly. "Reset, figure out what we're dealing with." Before Jake could respond, the cries moved again, this time to their left, maybe 30 yards out, then behind them, even closer, then to the right. The sound was circling them, repositioning with each call, getting nearer with each repetition. That wasn't possible. Coyote pups couldn't move that fast. Hell, adult coyotes couldn't reposition that quickly without making noise. The forest floor was covered in dry leaves and brittle twigs. Nothing could move through it silently while also crying out. Jake's pulse kicked up, adrenaline beginning to flood his system. His vision sharpened, pupils dilating to capture more light. His hearing became acute, picking up every tiny sound. Tyler's breathing, the faint whisper of wind through upper branches, the distant trickle of water in the creek bed behind them. The cries came from directly ahead now, close, 25 yards at most. Jake could make out a dark mass in the shadows between two large oaks, something big and low to the ground. His rifle came up automatically, sight picture forming, finger moving to the trigger. The mass didn't move. It sat there, backlit slightly by moonlight, just dark enough that he couldn't make out details. The size was wrong for coyotes. Too large, too solid. Maybe a bear? But bears didn't make those sounds, and this thing wasn't moving like a bear. Tyler had his rifle up too, both men covering the same target from slightly different angles. Good crossfire discipline, automatic after years of working together. The cries came from the dark mass. Perfect clarity, perfect pitch. And now, this close, Jake could hear something underneath the sound. Not an echo, not interference. A quality to it that his brain couldn't process, like hearing music played on instruments that didn't exist. "Contact your 9, Tyler breathed. Jake's eyes flicked left. Another dark mass, this one between a cluster of smaller trees. Same size, same stillness. Then movement in his peripheral vision, right side. A third shape. They were surrounded. Every instinct Jake possessed screamed at him to break contact, to move, to establish distance and better positions. They were in a bowl, low ground with higher terrain on all sides. Terrible tactical position. They'd walked into it like amateurs, following those sounds without maintaining situational awareness. He touched Tyler's shoulder, 2 quick taps, Break contact signal. Tyler nodded, and they started moving backward, keeping their rifles trained on the nearest shape. Slow steps, feeling for solid footing before committing weight. No sudden movements that might trigger a response. The dark shape ahead didn't react. It sat there, motionless, as that perfect cry continued to emanate from it. But it wasn't coming from where a mouth would be. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Directionless, despite the source being clearly visible. They'd backed up maybe 5 yards when the cry changed. Not the pitch or rhythm, but the emotional quality. It went from distress to something else. Not quite aggressive, not quite curious. If Jake had to name it, he'd call it playful. That's when he knew with absolute certainty that whatever was making those sounds understood exactly what it was doing. This wasn't animal behavior. This was something else. Faster, he whispered to Tyler. They picked up speed, still moving backward, still covering their 6. The shapes stayed where they were, dark and still and wrong, but the cries followed them, moving through the forest parallel to their retreat, keeping pace, maintaining distance. 20 yards, 30. They reached the creek bed again and crossed quickly, no longer caring about noise discipline. Their boots splashed through the shallow water, scrambled up the far bank. Jake risked a glance over his shoulder to navigate around a fallen log. When he looked back, the shapes were gone. The forest was empty except for trees and shadows and moonlight. No movement, no sound, no evidence that anything had been there at all. Even the cries had stopped, leaving only silence. They kept moving, maintaining their retreat for another 100 yards before Jake called a halt. Both men took positions behind a massive oak trunk, rifles covering the way they'd come, breathing hard from exertion and adrenaline. "What the hell was that?" Tyler asked, his voice tight. "I don't know. Those weren't coyotes." "No. Bears don't do that either." "I know." They waited, watching and listening. The forest had come alive again, normal night sounds resuming as if nothing had happened. An owl called from up the ridge. Something small rustled through leaves down slope. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the smell of damp earth and decaying vegetation. "We need to get back to the truck," Jake said finally. "Figure this out in daylight." Tyler didn't argue. They'd both learned in combat that sometimes discretion meant survival. When the situation stopped making sense, when your understanding of the environment broke down, you pulled back and reassessed. Pride got people killed. They started up the ridge, moving faster now, using their headlamps for the first time. The beams cut through darkness, illuminating tree trunks and forest floor, creating stark shadows that seemed to move with the light. Behind them, deeper in the hollow, a sound rose into the night. Not cries this time, something between a howl and a scream, low and resonant, carrying a quality that made Jake's spine go rigid. It lasted 5 seconds, maybe 10, then cut off abruptly. Neither man spoke. They just climbed, faster, legs burning, hearts racing, rifles ready. The truck waited 2 miles away, parked at the trailhead where the world made sense again. They reached the ridgeline 20 minutes later, both men breathing hard. From this height, they could see the valley below, scattered farmhouse lights, the distant glow of Gatlinburg. Civilization, ordinary and safe and comprehensible. Jake pulled out his radio to check the time. 2,237 hours. They'd been in the hollow for less than 90 minutes. It felt like days. "We tell anyone about this?" Tyler asked. Jake considered. What would they say? That they'd heard sounds that moved too fast and saw shapes that vanished? That something in these mountains could mimic coyote pups with perfect accuracy? Who would believe that? "We don't tell anyone anything," he said finally. "Not until we know what we're dealing with." Tyler nodded. They both understood that some experiences didn't translate well to words, that trying to explain would only make them sound unstable. Better to keep quiet, process it themselves, decide on next steps. They finished the hike to the truck in silence. Neither man looked back at the darkness behind them, but both felt the weight of it. Something was out there. something that used sound as a weapon, that understood human behavior well enough to manipulate it. Something that had led them exactly where it wanted them to go. Jake didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed next to Emily, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail. The perfect repetition of the cries, the dark shapes that didn't move right, that final sound that had sent them running. His brain kept trying to fit it into categories that made sense and kept failing. Around 0500, he gave up and went downstairs, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, searching for explanations he knew he wouldn't find. His phone buzzed at 0630. Tyler. You awake? Yeah. Meet me at the diner in 30. Jake drove through early morning fog that hung in the valleys like smoke. Gatlinburg was still asleep, the tourist shops dark, the streets empty. The Smoky Mountain Diner had its lights on, a handful of trucks in the parking lot, working men getting breakfast before their shifts. Tyler was already there, sitting in the back booth with coffee and a notebook. He looked about as rested as Jake felt. Been thinking about it all night, Tyler said without preamble, trying to make it make sense. Any luck? Not really. You? Jake shook his head. A waitress came over, filled his cup, took their order without much conversation. She knew them both, knew better than to push small talk when men had that particular look on their faces. When she left, Tyler slid the notebook across the table. He'd drawn a map of the hollow, marking their route, the locations where they'd heard the cries, their final position before retreat. Look at the pattern, Tyler said. Each time the sound moved, it got closer, but not in a straight line. It circled, like it was herding us into that bowl. Jake studied the diagram. Tyler was right. The sound had moved strategically, pushing them deeper into poor terrain, surrounding them in a place with limited escape routes. Exactly the kind of tactical positioning they'd been taught to avoid. Animals don't do that, Jake said quietly. No, they don't. So what does? Tyler leaned back, both hands wrapped around his coffee mug. I spent 2 hours this morning reading everything I could find about the Smokies. Wildlife, legends, unexplained incidents. You know what keeps coming up? Jake waited. People vanishing. Hunters mostly. Experienced guys who knew these mountains their whole lives. They go out and just disappear. No trace. Search parties find nothing. That happens in mountains. People get disoriented, fall, have medical emergencies. Sure, but some of these cases, Jake, they're weird. Bodies found miles from where they should be, in terrain that doesn't make sense. Or they find someone's gear but not the person. Or the person walks out days later with no memory of where they've been. Their food arrived. Jake pushed his eggs around, appetite gone. Tyler wasn't eating either. There's this thing in Cherokee folklore, Tyler continued. They don't talk about it much to outsiders, but it's in some of the old accounts. Something that walks on 2 legs but isn't human. Something that can mimic any sound perfectly. They say it hunts in the deep forest, that it studies people before it strikes. You think that's what we ran into? I think something led us into that hollow, using sounds it knew would work on us. Coyote pups in distress. What hunter wouldn't investigate that? It played us, man. Knew exactly what buttons to push. Jake felt cold despite the hot coffee. Tyler was articulating what he'd been avoiding thinking. They hadn't just encountered something strange. They'd been manipulated by something that understood human psychology. We need to go back, Jake said. In daylight? Yeah, see what's actually there. Maybe we'll find tracks, scat, something that explains it. Tyler nodded slowly. When? Today, this morning, before we talk ourselves out of it. They finished breakfast in silence, paid, and drove in Tyler's truck back toward Cosby. The morning sun had burned off most of the fog by the time they reached the trailhead. Everything looked ordinary in daylight, just trees and mountains and November woods. They geared up differently this time. Rifles, but also cameras, measuring tape, Jake's GPS unit. They were approaching this as an investigation now, not a hunt. Documentation mattered. The hike in felt different. The forest seemed smaller, less threatening. Birds called from the canopy. A gray squirrel barked at them from an oak branch. Normal sounds, normal behavior. Nothing like the oppressive silence of the previous night. They reached the ridge and descended into the hollow, following their tracks from the night before where boot prints showed in softer soil. Jake had Tyler wait at intervals while he photographed the terrain, establishing a visual record of their route. The creek bed showed their scrambling exit clearly, disturbed stones, muddy boot prints on the far bank. They crossed and continued to where they'd been when the shapes appeared. Jake stopped, studying the ground between the two oaks where he'd seen the first dark mass. Tyler moved to where the other shapes had been positioned. "Nothing here," Tyler called. "No prints, no scat, no disturbed leaves." Jake found the same at his location. The forest floor looked undisturbed, as if nothing had been there at all. But he'd seen something. They both had. 3 large shapes positioned in a triangle around them. He knelt down, examining the leaf litter more carefully. Standard November woods debris. Oak and hickory leaves, small twigs, acorn caps. Then he noticed something. The leaves around the base of the oak were compressed, flattened in a roughly circular pattern about 4 feet across. Not scattered like wind would do it. Compressed, like weight had been there. "Tyler, come look at this." Tyler joined him, studying the pattern. He pulled out his phone, took photos from multiple angles. "Something was here," Tyler said. "Something heavy enough to pack down the leaves." They found similar compression patterns at the other 2 locations, each roughly the same size, each showing the same weight distribution. Jake used his measuring tape, recorded dimensions, took more photos. "Look at the positioning," he said, stepping back to see all 3 sites. Perfect triangle. Each point has clear sightlines to the center. Classic ambush formation. Tyler had gone pale. "That's military thinking, Jake. That's not animal behavior." They continued deeper into the hollow, following the route the sounds had taken as they circled. At each location where the cries had originated, they found more compressed leaf patterns, 13 total, forming a spiral that had led them into the bowl. Jake photographed each one, his hands steady despite the growing dread in his gut. Whatever had done this had planned it, positioned itself at specific intervals, moved through the forest silently between calls, executed a complex maneuver that required coordination and intelligence. "We need to find that den," Tyler said, "the real one. If these things were mimicking coyote pups, there has to be an actual den somewhere." That's where they learned the sound. They spent the next 2 hours searching the area, working in expanding circles from their encounter site. They found deer tracks, turkey scratchings, the distinctive marks of feral hogs rooting for acorns. Normal forest activity. No coyote sign at all. "This doesn't make sense," Jake said. "The farmers all reported coyotes in this area. We should be finding tracks, scat, something." Tyler pulled out his phone, checking signal, 2 bars. He pulled up a map application, zooming out to show the larger area around Cosby and Pittman Center. "What if we've been looking in the wrong place?" he said slowly. "What if the real activity isn't here at all?" They hiked back to the truck, Jake's mind churning. At the trailhead, Tyler made some calls. First to Vernon Ramsey, the tobacco farmer who'd lost chickens, then to Otis Webb, then to the Caldwell place. When he finished, he looked at Jake with an expression somewhere between confusion and fear. "All the farms that got hit? They're on the other side of Gatlinburg, near Sugarlands, 10 miles from here, maybe more." Jake felt the pieces clicking together in a way that made his skin crawl. "So why did we hear coyotes here?" "We didn't," Tyler said quietly. "We heard something that wanted us to think there were coyotes here." They drove to Sugarlands that afternoon, connecting with Vernon Ramsey, who agreed to show them where he'd been losing livestock. The farm sat in a valley with thick forest pressing close on three sides. Perfect coyote habitat. Vernon led them to the chicken coop where he'd lost birds 2 weeks earlier. The fence showed definite damage, wire bent and torn. Inside, Jake found tracks in the soft dirt, clear canid prints, medium-sized, showing the distinctive pattern of coyote rather than domestic dog. "Can I look in the woods behind your property?" Jake asked. "Help yourself. Anything you can do to thin these bastards out, I'd appreciate it." They spent an hour searching the tree line and found what they were looking for half a mile in, a den site. Fresh excavation at the base of a rock outcropping, multiple entry holes, coyote scat scattered around the periphery. Recent activity, within the last few weeks. Tyler knelt down, examining the den entrance. "This is it. This is the real thing." Jake photographed everything, documenting the location on his GPS. His hands were shaking slightly. The implications were becoming impossible to ignore. Whatever they'd encountered in that hollow near Cosby hadn't been coyotes. It had found this den, observed it long enough to learn the sounds the pups made, then traveled 10 miles to a different location to use those sounds as bait. "It was hunting us," Tyler said, voicing what they were both thinking. "It studied the real coyotes, learned what sounds would work, then picked a location far from the actual den to set the trap." "But why?" Jake asked. "What would do that?" "Something smart enough to understand human behavior. Something that knew we'd investigate distress calls. Something that wanted to see how we'd react." They hiked back to Vernon's farm in silence. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley. Everything looked peaceful, pastoral, safe. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the tree line. Learning. Planning. That night, back at his kitchen table with all their photos and notes spread out, Jake tried to make sense of it. Emily had taken the baby to her mother's for the evening, giving him space to work. Tyler sat across from him, both men studying the evidence. "We tell anyone about this, they'll think we're crazy," Tyler said finally. "Yeah, but we can't just ignore it. This thing, whatever it is, it's still out there. It might try again." Jake looked at the photos of the compressed leaves, the strategic positioning, the careful spiral that had herded them into the bowl. Something was hunting in these mountains. Something that thought like a predator, but acted with human-level intelligence. "We go back," he said. "One more time, but this time we're ready for it. We know what to look for. We don't follow sounds blindly." Tyler nodded slowly. "When?" "Tomorrow night. We finish this." Neither man mentioned the obvious question, what if it wasn't finished with them? Outside, the November darkness pressed against the windows. Somewhere in those mountains, something moved through the forest on 2 legs, learning, watching, waiting for its next opportunity. They returned to the hollow Saturday night, better prepared this time. Jake had loaded his magazines with 165-grain soft points, rounds designed to deliver maximum energy transfer on impact. Tyler brought 30 rounds of 123-grain hunting ammunition for his AR. Between them, they carried enough firepower to stop anything that walked on 4 legs in North America. They'd also brought more light, high-powered flashlights mounted to their rifles, handheld spotlights, even road flares in their packs. If something came at them, they'd see it clearly this time. No more shadows and uncertainty. The hike in felt different, knowing what waited. Every sound made them tense. Every shadow drew their attention. They moved slowly, deliberately, checking terrain before committing to each section of trail. By 2010, they were back in the hollow, positioned on high ground overlooking the bowl where they'd been 2 nights before. Good fields of fire, multiple escape routes, solid cover at their backs. This time, they controlled the tactical situation. "We wait," Jake whispered. "Let it come to us." Tyler nodded, settling in behind a fallen log that provided both concealment and a stable shooting platform. Jake took position 15 feet to his right, giving them overlapping coverage of the approaches. The moon was waning, but still bright enough to illuminate the hollow. Jake could make out individual trees, the creek bed, the general shape of the terrain. His rifle scope was dialed to 4 power, giving him a good field of view while maintaining enough magnification for precision. An hour passed. The forest made its usual sounds. Wind through branches, small animals moving through undergrowth, the distant hoot of an owl. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening. Jake's legs started to cramp from holding position. He shifted slightly, trying to maintain circulation without compromising his sight picture. Tyler remained motionless, his breathing slow and controlled. At 22:15, the forest went quiet. Not gradually. One moment, there were normal night sounds. The next, there was nothing. Complete silence that felt like a physical presence pressing down on them from all sides. Jake's pulse accelerated. His finger moved from the trigger guard to the trigger itself, taking up the slack. Next to him, he heard Tyler's breathing change rhythm, faster and shallower. The cries started. Same sound as before, high-pitched yelping of distressed coyote pups. But this time, it came from multiple directions, simultaneously. 3 sources, maybe 4, all around the perimeter of the bowl, calling back and forth to each other in perfect synchronization. Jake's jaw clenched. It knew they were here. It was announcing itself, demonstrating that it remembered them, that it understood they'd come back. The cries stopped. Silence returned, heavy and expectant. Then, movement. Something emerged from the tree line on the far side of the bowl, maybe 70 yards distant. At first, Jake thought it was a bear, standing upright. Black bears did that sometimes when curious or trying to see over obstacles. But as it moved forward into better light, his brain struggled to process what he was seeing. It walked on 2 legs, with a gait that was almost human but not quite. The proportions were wrong, too tall. At least 7 feet, maybe more. Shoulders too broad, arms too long, hanging nearly to its knees. The legs bent correctly at the knee, but there was something about the way they articulated, like they had one too many joints, or the joints bent at slightly wrong angles. "You seeing this?" Tyler breathed. "Yeah. What is it?" "I don't know." The thing moved across the bowl slowly, not trying to hide or hurry. It walked with the confidence of something that had no predators, nothing to fear. Moonlight caught on its surface, and Jake realized it was covered in dark hair or fur, but not thick like a bear, closer to how he imagined Sasquatch might look in the old grainy photos. Except this thing moved with fluid coordination that suggested intelligence. It stopped in the center of the bowl, 70 yards from their position. Then it turned and looked directly at them. Jake couldn't make out facial features clearly at this distance, but he could see the shape of the head. More human than ape, but larger, broader, and the way it held itself, the way it tracked them with its gaze, suggested awareness that made his skin crawl. "We'd taken the shot?" Tyler asked quietly. Jake considered. They had positive identification of something threatening, unknown entity that had demonstrated hostile behavior. His training said engage the threat. But another part of his brain screamed that this was wrong, that shooting this thing would open a door better left closed. The creature took a step toward them. "Light it up," Jake said. Both their weapon lights came on simultaneously, 200 lumens each, punching through the darkness. The creature froze, caught in the overlapping beams like an animal on a highway, and Jake finally got a clear look at it. The face was the worst part. Not quite human, not quite ape. Something in between that evolution never intended. The eyes reflected their lights like a deer's would, throwing back an amber shine that looked intelligent and malevolent. The mouth was too wide, the jaw too heavy. But it had expressions. He could see that. This thing had facial muscles that moved with thought and intention. It looked at them for 3 seconds that felt like hours. Then it smiled. The expression was unmistakable. Lips pulling back from teeth that were too large and too white. Not a threat display. A smile of recognition, of understanding, of something that might have been amusement if the thing had human emotions. Jake's finger tightened on the trigger. The creature took another step forward. "Engaging," Tyler said, and fired. The AR barked, muzzle flash lighting up the night. Jake saw the hit, saw the creature's torso jerk as the round impacted center mass. Tyler fired again, then again, controlled pairs the way they'd been taught. Jake joined in, his .308 booming louder than Tyler's rifle. He aimed for the chest, the largest target, the place where heart and lungs would be on anything mammalian. The recoil was familiar, comforting. He worked the bolt, fired again. Another hit. The creature staggered slightly but didn't go down. It looked down at its chest where their rounds had hit, then back up at them, still smiling. Jake fired again. Tyler emptied his magazine. 30 rounds in rapid succession, most of them finding their target. At this range, they couldn't miss. They were both expert marksmen, had qualified sharpshooter or better in the Corps. Their rounds were hitting exactly where they aimed. But the thing wasn't falling. It bled. Jake could see that now. Dark fluid running down its torso where their bullets had punched through. But it didn't seem to care. It wasn't exhibiting any of the behavior a wounded animal should show. No pain response, no attempt to flee, no aggression. Jake reloaded, his hands moving automatically through the muscle memory of magazine change and bolt operation. He fired 3 more rounds, aiming for the head this time. 1 missed, but 2 hit. He saw the impacts, saw the creature's head snap back. It straightened, reached up with one massive hand and touched its face where the rounds had hit. Then it looked at its fingers, as if examining the blood there with curiosity. "This isn't working," Tyler said, his voice tight with panic he was fighting to control. The creature lowered its hand, then slowly and deliberately, it turned away from them. Not fleeing, not staggering, just turning as if it had lost interest. It walked back toward the tree line on the far side of the bowl, moving at the same unhurried pace it had used to approach. Jake fired again, hitting it between the shoulder blades. Tyler had reloaded and added his rounds. They put at least a dozen more bullets into the thing as it walked away, each impact visible, each one failing to drop it. They'd reached the trees and disappeared into the shadows. The forest swallowed it like it had never been there at all. That both men sat frozen, rifles still aimed at the tree line, breathing hard. Jake's ears rang from the gunfire. Spent brass littered the ground around them. The smell of burnt powder hung in the air. "We just shot that thing 20, 30 times, Tyler said finally. "Center mass, headshots, everything." "I know. That should have killed it. That should have killed anything." "I know." Jake's hands were shaking now, adrenaline crash hitting him as his body realized the danger was over. Except it wasn't over. That was the problem. You couldn't kill something that walked away from that much gunfire. You couldn't fight something that ignored physics and biology and everything he understood about living creatures. They stayed in position another hour, watching the tree line, waiting for the thing to return. It didn't. The forest remained quiet, offering no explanation, no closure. Finally, Tyler spoke. "We need to leave, now." Jake didn't argue. They gathered their brass out of habit, a Marine Corps ritual that felt absurd given what they'd just experienced, but provided something normal to focus on. Then they moved out, weapons ready, covering each other as they withdrew from the hollow. At the creek bed, Jake stopped, shining his light across the bowl one last time. In the center, where the creature had stood, the ground showed disturbance. Deep impressions in the soft earth, tracks that were almost human but elongated, showing too many toes and claws at the ends, where human feet had nails. He photographed them quickly, then they kept moving. The hike back to the truck took 40 minutes that felt like 4 hours. Every sound made them spin around, rifles coming up, lights cutting through the darkness, but nothing followed them. The forest let them go. At the trailhead, Tyler sat on his tailgate, head in his hands. Jake leaned against the truck bed, staring back at the mountains, silhouetted against the night sky. "We can't tell anyone about this," Tyler said. "They'll think we're insane." "Yeah. But we need to know what it is, what it wants." Jake thought about the smile, about the way it had examined its own blood with what looked like curiosity, about the intelligence in those reflected eyes. "I don't think we want to know," he said quietly. They drove back to town in silence, both men lost in thoughts they couldn't articulate. Behind them, the mountains kept their secrets, and somewhere in those dark hollows, something massive and bulletproof walked on two legs and smiled at the men who'd tried to kill it. The worst part wasn't that they'd failed to stop it. The worst part was the growing certainty that it had let them try, had stood there taking their rounds not because it couldn't avoid them, but because it wanted to see what they would do. They hadn't been hunting it at all. They'd been participating in its study of human behavior, specimens in an experiment they didn't understand. And somewhere in those mountains, it was still out there, still watching, still learning, still hunting. Jake didn't go into the woods for 3 months after that night, the longest he'd gone without hunting since he was 12 years old. He told Emily he was busy with work, that the construction schedule was demanding. She didn't push, but she knew something was wrong. You don't live with someone without learning to read the signs. Tyler took a week of personal leave and drove to South Carolina to visit his sister, put 500 miles between himself and those mountains. When he came back, he seemed steadier, but there was something different in his eyes, a wariness that hadn't been there before. They met at the diner in February, first time they'd seen each other since November. The conversation started with small talk, work and weather and local news. Neither mentioned the hollow or what they'd encountered there. But eventually, Tyler brought it out, the question they'd both been avoiding. "You been back?" Jake shook his head. "No. You?" "Not to that spot, but I went up to Cades Cove last weekend. Daytime hike with my cousin. Felt like I needed to try." "How'd it go?" Tyler was quiet for a moment. "I couldn't enjoy it. The whole time I was waiting for something to happen. Every shadow, every sound. Kept my hand near my sidearm the whole time." Jake understood completely. He'd driven past the trailhead twice, thought about stopping, couldn't make himself do it. The mountains that had been home his entire life now felt hostile, contaminated by knowledge he couldn't unlearn. "I've been reading," Tyler said. "Everything I can find about encounters like ours. There's more out there than you'd think." He pulled out a folder, photocopied articles and printed internet pages. Missing person reports from national parks, witness accounts of bipedal creatures in wilderness areas across North America. Patterns that emerged when you looked at the data systematically. "Look at this," Tyler pointed to a map he'd created, marking incidents across the Appalachian Range. Clusters, not random distribution. Clusters in areas with limited human access, deep forest, rough terrain. Jake studied the map. The Great Smoky Mountains had multiple marks. So did areas of West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, western North Carolina. Dozens of reports spanning decades. "What are you thinking?" Jake asked. "I'm thinking we're not the first people to run into these things. I'm thinking there's a population of them out there, living in the wilderness areas, avoiding humans mostly, but occasionally crossing paths. And when they do, people either don't report it or get dismissed as crazy." "You told anyone?" "No, but I've been in contact with some people online, other hunters, hikers, even a few former military. They've seen things too. Similar descriptions, same intelligence, same behavior patterns." Jake pushed the papers back across the table. "I don't want to know, Tyler. I can't. If I start going down this path, reading all this stuff, it'll consume me. I've got a family. I've got a life I'm trying to build. I know. I just thought you should know you're not alone. What we saw was real. Other people have seen it too. They finished their coffee in silence. Before leaving, Tyler said, "If you ever want to hunt again, I'll go with you. Daytime only, we stick together. But I understand if you're done with it." Jake didn't answer right away. Hunting had been part of his identity since childhood, the skills his father and grandfather had taught him, the traditions passed down through generations. Walking away from it felt like losing part of himself, but going back into those woods, even in daylight, felt like tempting fate. "I'll think about it," he said finally. He did think about it, for weeks. The woods called to him in ways he couldn't explain to Emily or anyone else. Not the specific hollow where they'd encountered the creature, but the forest in general. The smell of leaf mold and pine. The quiet punctuated by bird calls and rustling leaves. The satisfaction of providing meat for his family through his own skill and effort. In late March, he went out again, turkey season. He took his shotgun and drove to a spot near Douglas Lake, 20 miles from Cosby, in the opposite direction from the hollow. Public land that got heavy pressure from hunters, where anything unusual would be seen by dozens of people. He set up before dawn, calling occasionally, listening to gobblers sound off from their roosts. When one flew down and started coming to him, Jake felt something loosen in his chest. The bird appeared through the trees, strutting and drumming, responding to Jake's calls exactly the way it should. Jake took the shot. Clean kill. He walked over and picked up the turkey, a nice long beard with a 10-inch beard and sharp spurs. A good bird by any measure. But he didn't feel the satisfaction he used to. There was a shadow over it now. A knowledge that there were things in these woods bigger and stranger than turkey or deer. Things that couldn't be killed with shotguns or rifles. Things that hunted for reasons he couldn't understand. He hunted more that spring and summer, always in daylight, always in areas with good visibility and other hunters nearby. Tyler joined him sometimes, both men staying close, maintaining awareness that went beyond normal hunting caution. They never discussed the hollow or what they'd seen there, but it was present between them, an understanding that required no words. Other hunters noticed. "You boys jumpy about something?" One asked after Jake spun around at a squirrel running through leaves. "Ain't like you to be so wound up." "Just tired," Jake said. "Long week." But it wasn't just fatigue. It was the knowledge that when you walked into the woods, you weren't necessarily the apex predator, that something else was out there, something that understood humans well enough to manipulate them, intelligent enough to plan and execute complex ambushes, and powerful enough to shrug off gunfire that should have killed it several times over. Emily eventually got the story out of him. Not all of it, but enough. She'd wake up sometimes and find him standing at the window, looking out at the darkness, and she knew he wasn't just having trouble sleeping. "You saw something out there," she said one night. Not a question. "Yeah, something bad. Something I can't explain." She came and stood next to him, her hand finding his. "You don't have to go back. If the woods aren't safe anymore, that's okay. Nobody expects you to put yourself in danger. It's not about danger," he said slowly, trying to articulate something he barely understood himself. "It's about not knowing, not understanding what's out there or what it wants. That's harder than any combat I saw in Afghanistan. Over there, at least I knew what I was dealing with. This, I have no framework for this. So you and Tyler keep trying to figure it out. No, we're done trying. We just live with it now." And that was the truth. They lived with it. The knowledge that became background noise in their lives, always there but not always conscious. They adapted the way humans always adapt to uncomfortable truths, by incorporating them into their worldview and moving forward. Jake hunts now, 10 years later. So does Tyler. They'll go out for deer or turkey, fill their freezers, maintain the traditions their fathers taught them. But they follow rules they never had before. Never after dark. Never alone. Never in areas without cell service. never more than a mile from the truck, and never, under any circumstances, in the Great Smoky Mountains near Cosby after sunset. Other hunters think they're overcautious, maybe a little paranoid. Let them think that. Jake and Tyler know something most people don't, something they wish they could unknow. The footprints they photographed that night matched others found in wilderness areas across North America. Large bipedal impressions, nearly human, but not quite, showing details that suggested something both primitive and sophisticated. Park rangers find them occasionally and file them away without official comment. Serious researchers collect reports, build databases, search for patterns. But most people dismiss these accounts as misidentifications or hoaxes. They're standing upright, they say. Pranks, overactive imaginations. It's easier than accepting that something massive and intelligent shares our forests, something that has learned to avoid detection while occasionally demonstrating abilities that shouldn't exist. Jake keeps the photos on a password-protected folder on his computer, looks at them sometimes when he can't sleep. The compressed leaves, the tracks, the evidence of something that planned and executed a hunt with tactical sophistication that rivaled anything the Marine Corps had taught him. Tyler still researches occasionally, following reports from other states, other countries, patterns that suggest a worldwide phenomenon, something that has coexisted with humanity since before recorded history. But he stopped trying to convince anyone. The people who've experienced it know. Everyone else will believe what they want to believe. Both men still carry scars from Afghanistan, physical and psychological wounds that come with combat deployment. But neither of them have nightmares about Sangin anymore. When they wake up sweating at 0300, it's not IEDs or firefights they're seeing. It's a 7-foot shape standing in moonlight, smiling at them with too many teeth, absorbing bullets like raindrops, walking away into darkness while they empty their magazines in futile desperation. Emily asked Jake once if he regretted going into the hollow that night. Every day, he said. But at the same time, I'd rather know. I'd rather understand what's out there, even if I can't do anything about it, than go through life believing the world is simpler than it actually is. Do you think it's still there? I know it is. I've seen the reports. Hunters going missing, strange sounds, unexplained tracks. It's still there, still doing whatever it does. We just happened to survive our encounter with it. Do you think it let you survive? Jake had thought about that question a lot over the years. The way the creature had stood there, absorbing their fire, examining its wounds with what seemed like curiosity. The smile before they'd started shooting. The casual walk back into the forest afterward, unhurried and unconcerned. Yeah, he said finally. I think it could have killed us whenever it wanted. I think it was studying us, learning. We weren't prey that night. We were research subjects. The thought should terrify him. In some days it does, but mostly it just sits there. Another piece of information about how the world works. Humans aren't the only intelligent species. We're not alone at the top of the food chain. There are things in the deep woods that think and plan and hunt with purposes we can't understand. And sometimes, when you walk into the forest looking for prey, you become the prey instead. Jake Hutchins and Tyler Brennan aren't the kinds of men who seek attention or tell stories for dramatic effect. Both are employed, respected in their community, active fathers raising families in the same Tennessee mountains where their grandfathers were born. They served their country honorably, came home, and built ordinary lives. When they do share this account, which isn't often, they speak about it the same way they describe any other event from their lives. No embellishment, no theatrical delivery, just two men recounting something that happened and changed how they understand the world around them. Their credibility matters. These aren't civilians startled by shadows or misidentifying wildlife they've never encountered before. Jake and Tyler grew up hunting these mountains. They know the difference between a black bear on its hind legs and something that walks upright naturally. They've seen deer, elk, wild boar, coyotes, and every other animal native to the region. What they encountered that November night was none of those things. More importantly, they're trained observers. The Marine Corps doesn't just teach you to shoot, it teaches you to assess threats accurately under stress, to maintain composure when confronted with danger, to distinguish between fear and legitimate concern. When two combat veterans with infantry experience tell you they put 30+ rounds into something at close range and watched it walk away bleeding but unconcerned, that testimony carries weight. The physical evidence they collected sits in Jake's home office, digital photos of compressed vegetation in tactical formations, images of tracks that show clear bipedal locomotion with anatomical details that don't match any known North American animal, GPS coordinates marking the locations where sounds originated in patterns too deliberate to be natural. They've shown this evidence to a handful of trusted friends and family. Most people don't know what to make of it. It's easier to suggest misidentification, trick of the light, stress-induced misperception, anything but accepting that something unexplainable exists in those mountains. But the data doesn't support comfortable explanations. The creature they encountered demonstrated intelligence that rivals or exceeds human cognitive ability. It studied actual coyote behavior, learned specific vocalizations, then traveled miles to implement a complex ambush using that knowledge. It positioned itself in military-style formations. It stood and absorbed rifle fire with apparent curiosity rather than pain or fear, and it chose to leave rather than attack, suggesting restraint and decision-making capability. This challenges fundamental assumptions about what's possible. We like to think we understand the natural world, but science has cataloged and explained the important mysteries. The idea that something bipedal, massive, and intelligent could exist in North America without being definitively documented seems absurd in an age of trail cameras and satellite imagery. Yet wilderness areas are larger and more remote than most people realize. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park alone covers over 500,000 acres, much of it rarely visited by humans. Add in surrounding national forests, state parks, and private land, and you have millions of acres of dense forest where something could live largely undetected. And Jake and Tyler aren't alone in their experience. Search databases of missing persons in national parks and patterns emerge. Experienced outdoorsmen vanishing without trace. Search parties finding evidence in locations that make no sense based on last known positions. Cases where people are recovered alive, but with gaps in memory, or found deceased in areas they couldn't have reached through any logical route. Read enough reports from hunters, hikers, and park personnel, and themes repeat. Massive bipedal figures observed at distance. Vocalizations that don't match known animals. Rock throwing and wood knocking that suggests communication. Tracks that appear and disappear without explanation. And occasionally, encounters that turn threatening, where people realize too late that they're being stalked by something that understands human behavior. Most witnesses don't report these experiences. They fear ridicule, professional consequences, being labeled unstable. The ones who do come forward often face exactly that response. It's safer to stay silent, to carry the knowledge privately, to adapt behavior without explaining why. The Jake and Tyler adapted. They still hunt, still spend time outdoors, still maintain connection with traditions that matter to them. But they do it differently now. They've accepted that sharing certain spaces requires awareness and precaution, that wilderness isn't empty just because we don't see what inhabits it, that apex predator status is a comforting illusion rather than ecological reality. The question isn't whether something unknown exists in the Appalachian forests. The evidence suggests it does. The question is what it wants, how many there are, and whether our continued expansion into wilderness areas will eventually force confrontation rather than occasional encounter. Jake doesn't claim to know the answers, neither does Tyler. They just know what they experienced, what they documented, and how it changed them. They respect other people's skepticism because they understand how difficult these accounts are to accept, how they challenge consensus reality in ways that feel threatening rather than intriguing. But they also know that dismissing something doesn't make it disappear, that calling witnesses unreliable doesn't change what happened, that preferring comfortable ignorance over uncomfortable truth is a choice, not a conclusion. Somewhere in the mountains between Cosby and Gatlinburg, in hollows where cell service fails and human visitors are rare, something walks on two legs through the November darkness. Something that bleeds but doesn't die, that thinks and plans and hunts with intelligence we can't fully comprehend. Something that has learned to mimic the sounds that lure humans deep into terrain where escape becomes difficult. And sometimes, when hunters enter the forest believing they're pursuing prey, they discover too late that the roles have reversed, that the sounds they followed were bait, that the hunt they thought they were conducting was cover for a different kind of hunt entirely. Jake and Tyler survived that realization. They lived to walk out of those woods and return to their families. Whether that survival was luck, divine intervention, or the creature's deliberate choice to let them go, they'll never know for certain. But they think about it every time they hear strange sounds in the night, every time they see the Smoky Mountains silhouetted against the evening sky, every time someone suggests they're being overcautious about simple hunting trips. They think about it, and they remember, and they follow their rules, because somewhere out there, something is still watching, still learning, still hunting. And next time, it might not let anyone walk away.